the opportunities for crime are being converted into victimizations at a higher rate, certainly in a worse place than we were just a few years ago. And you started seeing more agitation on the activism side for policy changes that would reduce the powers that police had, that would reduce the scope of the criminal justice system or the footprint of the criminal justice system.
They control for the actual changes in our social behavior?
Crime of the sort that is going to land you in prison pretty much anywhere in the world in which you commit the crime. But what the criminal justice reform crowd has not been willing to recognize is that there is a much larger population of people on the street today who need to be locked up and are not. And people are victimized as a result. Well, that's also why we're an outlier on incarceration. You know, that explains quite a bit. And I think that is a huge problem with the overall approach of the police and criminal justice reform movement, not just in this city, but in this country.
Hello and welcome to New York Insider. I'm Liam O'Neill. Today I sit down with Rafael Manguel, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute who specializes in criminal justice. Rafael, thanks for being on New York Insider.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we spoke over the phone a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And I asked you a question, which is basically, where are we at in New York City vis-a-vis crime? And I want to just say one other thing with that before you answer. It seems that the feeling that people have and the data that we're presented, that there's kind of a disconnect.
A little bit.
Speak to that?
Yeah, well, look, I think the broader question of where we're at is certainly in a worse place than we were just a few years ago. I mean, there was a massive spike in homicides in 2020 that we haven't fully recovered from, even though we've seen homicides decline in the past 2 years. There was a massive spike, almost a doubling, in shootings that same year. We haven't yet gotten back to that pre-pandemic number. And then in 2022, there was a 22% increase in overall crime that has remained steady in 2023. So overall, the overall crime number was down 0.3%. So we're still very, very elevated in other felony crimes. So, you know, car theft, burglary, aggravated assault, etc. So things are certainly not as good as they were not very long ago. Now, things are moving in a positive direction on some fronts, right? The homicide numbers are going down a bit. Some of the assault numbers are not as high as maybe we might have expected them, or robbery numbers, etc. But one of the reasons I think that there's a little bit of tension between the data that is often presented, particularly by the liberal press that has, I think, a vested interest in sort of pushing back on the idea that crime has gotten worse because, you know, frankly, they're very much married to a lot of the reforms that preceded the increases. But I think the reason that there's a tension between those data and what people are feeling, what they're reporting, what they're saying to pollsters, has a lot to do with the fact that the data no longer tell the same story and require a lot more nuance to interpret accordingly. And I think that has a lot to do with what's happened since the pandemic.
Wait, hold on. Slow down there.
Yeah.
So there's a nuance to the data that we're just not
fully appreciating. So
Okay.
in 2020 with COVID, New York City changed in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Working from home went from something that, you know, was very, very rare to the norm. Mm-hmm. People were staying home. Businesses were shut down. They were not out on the street, which means that the potential for victimizations was depressed by that
because
change
less
in routine.
people are
exactly
out on the street.
Right. So there are fewer targets for crime. Now, what happened was that what we saw was a spike in homicides and a spike in shootings, but an overall crime decline, right? This is something the New York Times made a lot of at the end of 2020, right? The overall crime number had gone down. But when you actually control for the amount of time that people were spending in public, right? When you accounted for the fact that subway ridership had fallen through the floor, that work from home rates had gone through the roof, the potential victimizations had been converted at a significantly higher rate, so that your risk of being victimized had actually gone up significantly. This was a case that I had been making back then in the early days of 2020, and it's something that has since been borne out in the scientific research. So a scholar, Aaron Chalfin, along with Maxim Massenkoff of the Naval Postgraduate School, and Chalfin's at the University of Pennsylvania, recently published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they actually controlled for more time spent in public spaces in 3 cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and found that in 2020, despite overall crime numbers decreasing, the raw number counts decreasing, the risk of victimization had gone up about 30%.
Okay, so they control for the actual changes in our social behavior, and they find that the victimization rates are actually up. So crime is going down, but victimization is up.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. So the opportunities for crime are being converted into victimizations at a higher rate. Right. So the raw numbers that we're seeing, right? You often hear people say like, well, yeah, we had this many robberies in, 2015 or 2012, right? It's not that bad. It's like, yeah, but you have to understand, foot traffic in Midtown Manhattan is down like 30% as of last summer. On a given day, the Partnership for New York did a recent survey. I think on a given day, only 9% of office workers reported that they were going into the office 5 days a week. On a given day, it's like only about 40% or 50% of office workers are actually in the office on a random day during the week. Subway ridership.
So we're at 70% of foot traffic, 60% or 40%?
About 40 to 50% of
things are being cut in half. People on the streets are cut in half.
Subway ridership is still down 30%. Long Island Railroad ridership into the city is down 30%. Metro North ridership is down 30%. Right. So once people are shopping from home a lot more. Right. Ordering groceries. I had never heard of Instacart before.
I see.
I haven't been to a grocery store really since the pandemic, more than a handful of times. So people's behaviors have changed in a way that requires us to do a little more interpretive work when looking at crime numbers.
And now this is being borne out.
I think so.
With the controls.
Exactly.
People are doing studies that control for the changes in behavior.
Exactly.
And now they're finding then that crime...
That the crime is much higher than the base numbers that we're so used to consuming would indicate.
I see.
Right? So that, I think, is a big part of the tension. Another potential part of the tension is that it's always been the case that the vast majority of crime does not actually get reported to police. But I think that phenomenon has probably gotten worse, particularly in New York City.
Non-reporting or underreporting?
Underreporting of crime or non-reporting of crime. And I think that has probably a lot to do with response times. So if you look at police response times, particularly for lower level calls, right? So calls that are not involving a crime in progress. So either a crime that's occurred after the fact or, a suspicious person call or, whatever. The response times have just gone up significantly.
I see.
It's now like 27 minutes is the average wait time for the lowest priority call. So when response times go up, the research tends to show that reporting rates go down. People they don't wait around that long. The longer the response time takes, the more likely it is that the person who called leaves and the police are unable to make contact. So as that happens and as that gets ingrained in the populace's sort of mental model, people just become less likely to report the crime at all. Right? If they think like, okay, my cell phone got snatched on the subway, but I'm going to stay in here for a half an hour to make a report, and it's probably not going to result in my cell phone actually coming back. Whatever, I'll just eat it and go about my day.
Our expectations for police have gone down?
I think so. I mean, and why wouldn't they? Right? The NYPD is down like something like 2,400 officers.
Out of 30,000 or something?
Well, we had 36,000. I think we're down to like 33,000 and a little bit of change now. At the same time, crime has gone up, right? So the demands for service have gone up at a time in which the size of the force has shrunk. You've got, this new protest culture where, that's requiring a big police presence, right? You have streets getting shut down, bridges getting shut down, Penn Station, Grand Central.
Are you referring to Israel-Hamas conflicts?
Those, but even, before that in 2020 with the BLM protests and the sort of...
Protest culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's exploded. Right, so the demands on police service have increased significantly in that regard, right? Because these are events that require a big police presence, which further constrains their ability to be responsive to the sort of more routine calls that are coming in. So I think, and the other thing too is like population has gone down in New York City, right? So
depending on how you count it, at least 5%.
It's about 5%, since the pandemic. A little bit, yeah, but they haven't come close to fully erased. I think it's 5% on net.
On net, exactly.
Net of the incoming migrants, right? So yeah, there are all these reasons why I think there might be some tension between the vibes, as the kids say, and what the data say. But I actually think that you can read the data in a way that actually perfectly aligns with what people are reporting, in terms of how they feel about public safety. You just have to do a little more interpretive work to get there.
You can read it that way, but
I think you should read it that way. I think
yeah,
that's
maybe
the correct
you think so,
way.
but there are other people who are
Sure.
reading it a different way, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think they're reading it a different way because, partly they want to dissociate what's happened over the last few years in the way of crime increases from the policy program that they have enthusiastically promoted for the last decade plus.
So take us there. That was my next question.
Yeah.
How did we get here? I mean, we have a pandemic, obviously.
Sure.
That's changing
Although I think it
lifestyle.
started before the pandemic.
But you think it started, so how? What are the 2 or 3 or 4 big policy issues that got us from, in the heyday of, 2000s, 2010s, those were good years, right?
Sure.
In New York City.
Yeah.
And now there's a
Yeah,
dramatic
I think in a lot of
change.
ways we've been a victim of our own success, right? As crime continued to plummet, people grew increasingly uncomfortable with the kind of aggressive posture that got us there, that got us to that point. And you started seeing more agitation on the activism side for policy changes that would reduce the powers that police had, that would reduce the scope of the criminal justice system or the footprint of the criminal justice system. And I think that really started in terms of gaining momentum in 2009 with the Rockefeller drug law amendments. So those were the mandatory minimums for a lot of different drug offenses. Those were essentially gutted in 2009. Then, the police reform was a major issue in the mayoral campaign in 2012. Bill de Blasio, rides that issue into City Hall, and one of his first acts as mayor is to drop the city's appeal on the ongoing litigation with respect to stop and frisk. And what happens over the next year is that there's something like a 90% decline in reported stops done by the NYPD, right? So that's not a small thing. Now it's interesting, right? Because one of the things that people said in the immediate aftermath, right, in the year that followed that, they would say, like, well, look, stops went down 90% and the sky hasn't fallen, so clearly it wasn't doing anything, right? I don't think there was any reason to expect the effect would necessarily be immediate. I mean, for one thing, New York City was a very different city in 2014 and 15 than it was, in the mid-1990s when stop rates started to really go up. In the year 2000, I think we had like 13 or 14 precincts that were seeing 20 or more murders a year. By 2014, I think there was only one precinct in the city that had seen more than 20 murders a year, right?
Repeat that?
In the year 2000, at the turn of the century, I think there were more than 10, at least 13 precincts in New York City that saw more than 20 murders a year.
Okay.
By 2014, there was only one precinct in the city that was seeing 20 murders a year, right? So the city had changed in a lot of important ways. The built environment had changed, ways that made the city less conducive to crime, right? So there was no real reason to think that things were going to change overnight, but I think it was a harbinger for what was going to come, right? So shortly after the stop and frisk litigation decision, right, the NYPD's put under a corporate monitorship. Then you have, sort of different initiatives coming out of City Hall and at the state level, right? So from City Hall, you have the push on Rikers Island, which starts with, banning solitary confinement, first for teenage detainees, then for detainees 21 and under, then the push to close Rikers Island, which eventually gets over the hump. Right now, we're supposed to close Rikers Island and replace it with a system that caps the population of jail inmates at 3,500, which is significantly lower than what we currently have. We have about 6,000 people in the city jail system now, which is about 50% less than what it was 10 years ago, right? So we've already been moving in this direction, right? If you look at the incarceration.
So occupancy, they want occupancy in prisons to go way, way down.
Way, way down. In jails, right? This is the city jail system, right? But at the prison level, we have seen a similar trend, right? The prison population in New York State, the bulk of which comes from New York City, has been going down steadily over the last decade. Part of that has been helped along by different policy initiatives, right? The Rockefeller drug law amendments that I mentioned, but also, more recent policy changes. You have, in 2021, we have the Less is More Act, which is a parole and probation reform that makes it much more difficult to send parolees back to prison for technical violations, including for being arrested for new crimes. Even before that, you had the bail reforms, the discovery reforms that went into effect in 2020 and 2018. You had the Raise the Age law, which was a juvenile justice initiative that made it much more difficult to send teenage convicts to prison, even for serious felony crimes. At the city level, you've got the Right to Know Act in 2018, which required police officers now to affirmatively apprise people of their right to refuse consent for a search. It required police officers to now give a business card with their first name to everybody that they made contact with who asked for one. Then you have, the How Many Stops Act, which recently just got passed. You have the work around qualified immunity.
So I asked you for 2, 3, or 4.
Oh, it's a litany. It's a litany, right?
I think we're at a dozen right now.
Yeah, at least, right? And I haven't even finished, right? I mean, there's so much movement.
Both at the state and city level.
Both at the state and city level. So much has happened, right?
Would you say, I guess they're tying the hands of the police?
They're tying the hands of the police. They're reducing the scope of powers that police have, but they're also making the police less effective by reducing the ability of the criminal justice system to act as a backstop to those efforts that the police are doing, right? I mean, an arrest used to mean something because it meant that somebody who was actively committing crimes was being taken off the street, at least for some period of time, right? That person might get held in pretrial detention. They might not be able to make bail for a week, and be stuck on Rikers. That provided some relief. And when they were convicted, there was a higher chance of them actually doing time. All of that has changed, right? And that's just on the actual policy front. Then you have, the progressive prosecutor movement, which has certainly touched New York City and, both in Brooklyn and Manhattan, almost in Queens. I think Tiffany Caban, who's now on the city council, lost that election by something like 70-something votes. I mean, it was a very, very tight race. The city council has become increasingly more radical over the years. I don't think we can say that it's 1 or 2 or 3 policy initiatives that have taken us down this road. I think it has been a slow and then faster and really steady march down this road toward depolicing and decarceration.
I've heard it said that in the 90s, 80s, let's say, when 70s and 80s, when policing was just, when crime was rampant, right? New York City was not on anyone's list. It was a dangerous place to be.
Yeah.
And in the 90s, there was an opening up where people were willing to shake hands across the aisle, right, left, center, every color under the sun. They could come together and try to think about what happens. And in that milieu of the 90s, where people were exhausted over the out of controlness of the city, they found some new hope and new policies and wildly successful.
Very successful.
Right? New York City just changed like no other city had ever changed before.
It was a complete turnaround.
In less than a decade, or just right.
Yeah,
less than a decade, things changed very quickly, and clearly it was about what I'm trying to describe. There was a partnership.
Yes,
there was a lot of talk, and it seems to me one way to sum up what you're saying with all of these dozens of policy changes and political things behind the scenes, but a political shift. These partnerships have broken down.
Yeah, well, the issue of crime became politicized in the late 90s and 2000s, and it just got worse to the point where, it became the sort of centerpiece of, the progressive brand in New York City and in cities across the country, right? Criminal justice and police reform became the rallying cry. It became, one of the most potent trademarks of democratic city politics. And so it's not a surprise to me that you started to see more division out of this issue. I mean, I think what happened in the 90s was just a result of the fact that things had gotten so bad that no one could deny that something needed to be done.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it was just, you had Rudy Giuliani, who's a Republican mayoral candidate, winning in 1993. I mean, he came close in 1989, but no one would have thought, right, like a Republican candidate had a shot and then gets reelected. You have Pataki. It's like, at the time, I think people were just so fed up and knew that something needed to change. and that I think opened things up to that kind of bipartisanship that you described, and you had people like Joe Biden, architecting the 1994 crime bill, which was signed, by Bill Clinton, and even before that, you had the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which is decried now as one of the most racist pieces of legislation because it established the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, but it passed the Senate 97-3. It got 16 of the 19 members of the Congressional Black Caucus to co-sponsor it. Not just vote for it, but co-sponsor it, right?
Wow.
I mean,
we can't imagine that political scene now.
Well, you can if things continue to get really, really bad. And that's what I hope doesn't have to happen. I mean, in 1990, I was in pre-K. My son's in pre-K now. That year, New York City had 2,262 murders. When I came back from Chicago in 2015, within 2 years, we hit our valley of 292 murders in 2017. That is an enormous amount of progress. That is a 180-degree turn.
Record-breaking,
yeah.
I would say, right?
I mean, you would never expect to see that. And I think a lot of people have forgotten how bad things can get. And I think, like I said, we've been a victim of our own success insofar as over that 25-year period of pretty consistent crime declines, the city was able to fortify itself in ways that made it much less vulnerable to crime increases, even in response to rather radical shifts in policy. And that has just emboldened progressive activists even more to continue pushing the envelope. And it's just only a matter of time until that rhetoric runs up against reality. And I think we're starting to see that, and which is why I think we're starting to see some of these progressive enclaves kind of show signs of reversing course. Now, this could be the election season, right? But you have Kathy Hochul announcing the National Guard is going to be doing searches in the bag checks in the New York City subway system. You've got D.C. Doing this omnibus crime fighting bill. You've got San Francisco putting this anti-crime ballot initiative forward, where police chases are going to be expanded, and in D.C. they're considering lowering the threshold for felony theft. I mean, walking back a lot of the sort of signature policies that have sort of characterized the left's criminal justice reform push over the last decade. And so
you said criminality became a branding issue, a brand for progressive politics.
Criminal justice reform, I think, is how they would put it. I mean, but that became a centerpiece in the left's brand.
Now, isn't that partly because, I mean, America leads the world in incarceration?
Yes.
We have more people in jail than, I don't know, the next 10 or 12 NATO countries combined.
Right. It's often said we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. I think those numbers are probably a little different now because we've cut our incarceration rate pretty significantly.
But clearly it was a response to that.
Yeah, we have been an outlier on incarceration for quite some time.
Why? And the other part of that, correct me if I'm wrong, but my little preliminary research before this showed that it's been in my lifetime, in 3, 4, 5 decades, that it has ballooned to this extent. Giving credence to the claim that criminal justice is totally corrupt. It's a huge money-making industry, and there's every incentive to keep people behind bars because people are making money from it.
Yeah, I've never understood the profit argument because I don't really see it, right? It costs taxpayers ultimately, right? I mean, in a lot of the criminal justice reform measures that were successful, even in conservative states like Texas, for example, they were pushed as sort of good government programs, ways to cut spending and ease the burden on taxpayers. So if anything, I mean, having a robust criminal justice system is actually very expensive, particularly for the tax base, which ultimately has to foot the bill. But it's true. Yeah, we are an outlier internationally on incarceration, but we're also an outlier internationally on serious crime. Crime of the sort that is going to land you in prison pretty much anywhere in the world in which you commit the crime. This is something that
we're a violent society.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is something that people on the left are very quick to remember within the context of a different debate, that debate being gun control. I mean, you talk about gun control for 5 minutes and we start seeing the unfavorable international comparisons about how much of an outlier the United States is on gun violence compared to every other Western European democracy. Well, that's also why we're an outlier on incarceration. That explains quite a bit. I wrote this book a couple of years ago, and I did this analysis in the book looking at 2018 data And just a handful of neighborhoods in 4 American cities, which had a combined population of like 472,000 people, had 10% of all the homicides seen in England, Wales, and Germany in 2018, despite housing less than 0.5% of their combined population. Right? So we just have many more pockets of serious concentrated violence, but we're also a very wealthy society. And what that means is that we're able to invest in our criminal justice apparatus. We're able to invest in police, in policing technology, in prosecutions, so that we can actually pursue, detect, and punish a lot bigger share of our crime problem than a lot of other less wealthy nations can, right? I mean, like, you take a nation like Brazil, has a much more serious crime problem, at least historically, than the United States, but a lower incarceration rate. Is that because they're less punitive, or is it because
They don't have the money.
they just don't have the resources to detect the level of crime that we're able to detect? And on the punitive comparisons too, I mean, consider the fact that in the UK, the mandatory minimum sentence for illegal gun possession is 5 years in prison, and you have to serve a minimum of 3.5 years before you're eligible for parole. Mm-hmm. That's an offense that's regularly met with probation here in the United States. So it's not necessarily that we're more punitive. It's just that we have a lot more of the sort of crime that's going to land you in prison for a long time. And once you control for that, those disparities start to look a little different. And you mentioned that this has happened really over the course of the last few decades, really since the 70s. And I think that's true. But one of the things that often gets left out of that conversation is, up until the 70s, we had a pretty large institutionalized population, many of which, have ended up in the criminal justice system now after the deinstitutionalization movement, right? So our incarceration rate...
Mental health?
Yes.
And the like?
Yes. So we had asylums. At one point, I think our peak in the late 1950s, we had over 500,000 people in asylums in the United States. Now, that's generally not considered incarceration, but when you consider the role that serious mental illness plays in crime, and the level of mental health problems that we see in our prison and jail populations, I think one of the things we have to just account for is that the deinstitutionalization movement has also fed our incarceration rate to some degree or another. But the main point about the growth of incarceration is that incarceration growing on its own does not reveal a problem in and of itself, right? It's not prima facie evidence that something has gone awry. The question is whether that has produced benefits or not. And what's undeniable is that the buildup of incarceration that occurred particularly over the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s helped reduce crime quite a bit.
Helped reduce crime.
I mean, and it's not that hard to understand how, right? I mean, when you incarcerate someone, you are physically incapacitating them. You are stopping them from victimizing anybody outside the jail or prison walls, right? I mean, the research generally shows that for the marginal prisoner, for every year that they're incarcerated, society is spared 8 index felonies, right? That's probably an undercount, actually, because that number is generated by crime reports, and most crime doesn't actually get reported, right? But even if you accept it, that's a significant amount of relief for a community, particularly when you consider how concentrated crime is, right? It's not like we talk about crime as this national issue, and I get that it is all of our problems, right? We should see us as having a stake in it as Americans. But the reality is that it's a problem that affects very, very discrete areas very, very intensely, right? It is not an evenly distributed phenomenon. It's not an evenly distributed phenomenon in the country. It's not an evenly distributed phenomenon in New York City.
So spell that out a little bit more, please.
Yeah. So in New York City, for example, right, we have about 80,000 street segments. So a street segment would be corner to corner, both sidewalks. About 4% of our street segments will see 50% of all the violence.
4% of our street segments see 80%.
50%.
50% of
all the violence. 1% of our street segments see 25% of the violence. Yeah. Right? It is,
and that's not unique to New York City.
It's not. That analysis has been replicated in cities across the country and around the world. Right? This it actually has a name called the rule of crime concentration, which was developed by a criminologist named David Weisbrod, who's at George Mason University, and he actually recently did a study for the Manhattan Institute looking at crime concentration in the city in 2010, 15, and 20. And what he found was, it was about 3.5% of street segments saw 50% of all the violence in those years. And it's also very concentrated demographically, right? So in New York City, from like 2008 to 2021 or 22, we kept very clear data in these crime victimization reports that the NYPD would publish, looking at victimization rates and suspect rates broken down by race for all sorts of crimes. If you looked at shootings, every single year for which the NYPD tracked that measure, every single year, a minimum of 95% of the shooting victims in this city were either black or Latino.
Mm-hmm.
We don't constitute 95% of New York City's population. We've never come close. Yet we were 95% at least. In some years it was 98%, at which point it might as well be 100, right? So we have to understand that the crime problem in this country impacts the least advantaged of us. It impacts low-income, minority neighborhoods, usually in large cities, in parts of large cities that are already struggling with economic depression and disinvestment and all these other social ills. So and that explains why I've been so critical of the reform movement insofar as it has cut into those incapacitation benefits by trying to reduce the prison population for its own sake, by trying to cut the jail population for its own sake, without any consideration of the degree to which the individuals who are currently locked up pose a risk to society. Right? It is certainly the case that there are some individuals incarcerated today who do not need to be incarcerated. We should identify them and secure their releases. I don't think anyone's opposed to that. Right? But what the criminal justice reform crowd has not been willing to recognize is that there is a much larger population of people on the street today who need to be locked up and are not. And people are victimized as a result. I mean, there are countless stories that you see over and over and over again where someone is murdered or raped or robbed at gunpoint by someone who has 15, 20, 30 prior arrests. They're out on probation, they're out on parole, they're out on pretrial release. How many bites at the apple should somebody get before society says enough?
So we need some detailed or precise maybe reforms to better lessen the amount of wrongfully convicted.
Sure.
But we're approaching it with a blunt.
Yes, it's a
measure.
It's a sort of dragnet approach, right? I mean, the idea, and you see this with like the progressive prosecutor movement too, right? One of the things that characterizes a quote unquote progressive prosecutor is that they have these non-prosecution lists, right? These broad lists of offenses that they're just not going to go after anymore. And they say, well, they defend this by saying it's an exercise of discretion. No, an exercise of discretion would be to look at these cases on an individual basis and say, okay, well, this guy doesn't need to go in for, shoplifting. It's his first offense. He doesn't have a criminal record. He's not, in the gang database, whatever. We're going to go easy on him. But this guy, well, he's got 4 gun charges in the last 2 years. He needs to go in. That would be an exercise of discretion. But instead, what they do is they have these blanket policies. We're no longer going to pursue these offenses. We're no longer going to pursue these sentencing enhancements in all cases, right? And I think that is a huge problem with the overall approach of the police and criminal justice reform movement, not just in this city, but in this country.
You spoke last week at the end of February or beginning of March on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
And you were called there to talk about decarceration.
Yep.
And your position was, well, one of the things I read your testimony, you identified that there are hidden costs to decarceration.
Yeah.
Can you explain those?
Yeah. I mean, these are the costs of the offenses committed by people who could have been but weren't behind bars, right? I mean, crime is not cheap for society, right? It has a price tag to it. It's harder to estimate.
Homicide is $7 million?
Some estimates range even higher than that, almost $9 million at the high end.
So one homicide will cost a city
up to $9 million.
Up to $9 million with all of the appeal and
not just that,
going through the whole criminal justice system.
But also, the economic disinvestment that happens as a result, the trauma experienced by the victim, the medical costs, the cost to society of having to, detect, prosecute that crime, incarcerate the individual responsible for it, the lost earnings of the person who has been taken from us, right? All their potential, economic production, right? And also all the other ripple effects to broader society. I mean, one of the things that you see is we often think about crime just in terms of the perpetrator and the victim, right? It's a natural thing. But the reality is that serious crime has ripple effects that go throughout an entire city, an entire community. One of the things that you see is that when crime goes up, economic investment goes down. Economic mobility rates go down. You're less likely to move up a quintile in terms of earnings if crime is going up in your city, right? And one of the reasons for that is who wants to invest in a place where you're not safe, right? As employers, decide to pick other places, as retailers shutter, which is something that we see happening around the country, right? These are lost economic opportunities for those communities that frankly need them the most. But then there are also other effects, right? There are mental health effects. There's a trove of research showing that exposure to gun violence increases depression rates and, has all kinds of deleterious mental health effects. It affects even educational performance for school-age children. Right?
There's a lot of kids with trauma coming out of those.
There was a study that I saw that really moved me a few years back. I forget who the authors were, but they looked at kids who lived within, it was like a 2-block radius of a shooting, and kids who lived outside the radius, and they controlled for all kinds of factors, so that the only difference between these students was whether or not they lived within the radius of the shooting. The kids who lived within the radius of the shooting, after all the controls were put in, were performing statistically significantly worse on standardized exams than their classmates who lived outside that radius. Right? The exposure to gun violence has effects that go well beyond the immediate victim of that gun violence.
So clearly you have made a case for not being all on board with decarceration.
Yeah.
Also not being all on board with a lot of the criminal justice reforms that have, in your opinion, led to this uptick in crime that we're seeing now.
Yeah.
What about stopping crime at the root? I mean, you said a moment ago that, what's the rule, that 2% of neighborhoods have 98% of crime, or
it
something
was,
like this?
5% of street segments leave 50% of the violent crime. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do we stop crime where it starts?
It's a great question. I don't think anyone knows, and people who tell you they do are lying. Right. This is the lack of humility that I think we see in a lot of the criminal justice reform movement. A lot of the advocates will make this exact case. They'll say, no, we need to take what we're investing in policing and incarceration and reinvest that in addressing the root cause of crime.
And what does that look like?
I don't know. Education spending increases, more welfare spending. Their idea seems to be that
their idea is that it's material.
Yeah, that crime is just a function of poverty or some other socioeconomic indicators that we can just spend our way out of.
And you disagree?
I disagree vehemently. I don't think that there's any evidence.
There's no evidence that lack of resources
is driving
crime.
violence. No. I mean, I'll give you a couple of things to think about. So I mentioned the homicide peak in 1990. If you look at the poverty rate in New York City in 1989, it was actually slightly lower than the poverty rate in New York City in 2016. And it held...
What? Say that again?
The poverty rate in 1989 in New York City was
when crime was through the roof.
Yes, was slightly lower than the poverty rate in New York City in 2016.
Well, that's kind of astounding.
1989 is the year before we peaked in homicides, and 2016 is the year before we hit our valley. And it basically held steady throughout that entire time. We had a near doubling in the unemployment rate in this country and in this city during the Great Recession. Between 2006 and 2010, the unemployment rate in the United States doubled. The homicide rate decreased by 15%. To suggest that this is a problem we can buy our way out of. Right? I mean, how many trillions of dollars have we spent on anti-poverty programs in this country over the decades? Why didn't that manifest in crime declines recently? Why did we have this massive spike despite all that previous spending?
So we can't spend our way out. Is there evidence out there for programs that do work? What does work?
What works is policing. Incarceration work extremely well. Don't get me wrong. There are things that you can do to reduce crime at the margins, right? There's research showing that youth summer employment programs can help. Drug treatment, etc. But those effects are going to be, again, at the margins. In terms of, they're going to be small. They're not going to turn a city around the way that New York City was turned around in the 1990s, right? We did that through policing and through incarceration. We invested in police. We increased the number of officers on the force. We gave them new tools and new powers, and we backed those efforts through a robust prosecution campaign that reflected, that people were fed up with crime. And what that meant was that not only were you more likely to get caught for committing a crime, but when you were caught and you were prosecuted, you were going to be convicted. And when you were convicted, you were going to go away for a longer time than you would have gone away 10 years prior. right? We saw an increase in the amount of time that people were actually spending inside when they were convicted of felony crimes in New York City throughout the 1990s. And I think that's what produced the benefits. And I think it's very clear that it did. And this is something that even the most progressive, sort of decarceration advocates will admit if forced to, right, on the record. I mean, Patrick Sharkey, who's, a very good scholar, he's at Princeton, but, also an advocate for decarceration. I think, he would, I think he would say that characterization is fair. In a Washington Post op-ed, I think in 2020, he said that one of the most robust and consistent, if uncomfortable, that was his word, findings in the criminological literature is that more police means less crime. In his book, Uneasy Peace, which I think people should read, I don't agree with the policy prescriptions in it, but it's a worthwhile read. He says there's really no debate about whether mass incarceration reduced crime, right? It's very clear that it did. Now he thinks there are other ways that we can reduce crime that we should pursue rather than incarceration. I disagree, but yeah. So it's very clear that these things work, right? I think history has borne that out. I think the research has borne that out. The idea that we should experiment with these other things, I think, is misguided for a couple of reasons. One, it's not at all clear that it's going to work.
Other things like what?
Social spending programs and that sort of thing.
The youth employment.
Right. But two, even if we gave the decarceration advocates their sort of utopia, right? Like, here's all the money to spend on whatever you want. Even assuming that it all works and goes according to plan, we're not going to see the benefits for at least a generation. But people are being victimized now. They need help now. And nothing can provide the short-term benefits that policing and incarceration and prosecution can.
Raphael, thanks a lot for the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming on New York Insider.
Appreciate it.